All right, welcome to what is in AP US history would be chapter 36. In US history, it would be chapter 26. What we're going to look at today is talking about the continuation of the Cold War. If you remember, the Cold War is the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union that occurs following World War II. It's the competition really between the two over who's going to be the world power, who gets to dominate. It all, of course, as you remember, starts off really at the end of World War II after the United States uses the atomic bomb and will continue until 1989, 1992 approximately. So where we're at, or what this section here is just going to look at the Korean War and the rise of the Korean War, how we get to that point. The Korean War will, of course, will occur shortly after World War II. In the United States, it's often referred to as the Forgotten War. It was sort of something that we fought almost out of principle rather than this burning desire to save the world from an evil power like we had done with World War II. So, in order to get to the Korean War, we have to sort of see this what sparks this fear in Americans, and that is the fact that communism isn't being contained. It's not being stopped. It is spreading, and something that we thought, well, people will see what's going on in the Soviet Union, and they will agree that what we have going on is far, far better than whatever they have. So they'll, of course, want to follow American democracy, and we see that that's not happening. So the first we're going to look at is China becoming communist. So the Chinese communists are led by Mao Zedong. He was going against the former nationalist ruler, so not a democracy, but not communist. And his name is Chiang Kai-shek. The U.S. At this point had begun sending money to the nationalists. We didn't want to send soldiers. We really just wanted to sort of throw money at the problem and hope that the Chinese nationalists could um, remain in power without us having to militarily assist. The nationalists had bonded with Americans over our mutual dislike of the Japanese during World War II. But the U.S. at least recognizes that Chiang Kai shek's government is not without fault. It's extremely corrupt. But they simply just aren't communist. And at this point, the United States is willing to put on blinders for any ruler that is not communist. We don't care what their ruling style is. As long as you aren't communist, we're willing to support you. And this is going to be our philosophy for a good number of years. It's part of what will get us involved in the Vietnam War. And it will continue again up through the Cold War. You'll see different variations depending on who's president. So um, the problem is that Chiang himself doesn't do a lot to promote the Nationalist Party agenda, mostly because he's sort of corrupt himself. Um, for example, during the 1944 famine, the nationalist government is still collecting a grain tax when the people are starving. So I guess it's kind of the Marie Antoinette idea of letting them eat cake, just not really caring about the people. The problem is that the Communist Party is offering people this compassion and care that they're not seeing from the nationalists, and that's what will spark the continued rise of the Communist Party within China. So Mao Zedong is the leader of the Communist Party in China. He gets a large following among the peasants in China. Because remember, in communism, the way that it's going to go is we're all going to have an equal amount. We're all going to have our fair share. So if you have a lot to begin with, you're not going to be happy with the reallocation of resources because that means funds that are yours are going to be taken from you and given to someone that doesn't have anything. And so the majority of the people that tend to get behind communism are intellectuals, but also those in the peasantry. We saw this in Russia before it became the Soviet Union. We see this in China as well. We also see this later on in Cuba. So what happens is the peasants who make up the majority of the population rush to join the Red Army, again, red being the color of communism, and support Mao. And by 1945, much of northern China is actually controlled by the Communist Party. This is just looking at the two leaders themselves. Chiang Kai-shek rules in the South and the East. He relies heavily on aid from the United States, and pretty much without that, if we had not backed him, China would have fell way quicker than it did. He's struggling with rising inflation, a poor economy. He's got a weak leadership that people don't really like him that much. He's just negative all the way around. But again, in the United States mind, he's not communist, so that's anything is better than communism. Mao Zedong rules in the north. He relies on aid from the Soviet Union. He's promising land reform, which attracts the poor farmers, and he benefits because he personally had experience within the guerrilla army. So a civil war essentially happens between the communists and the nationalists after Japan ends their occupation following the end of World War II. The United States again supports the nationalists. From 1944 to 1947, we try desperately to negotiate a peace between the two groups. Again, we continue to throw money at the problem in the form of $2 billion rather than wanting to send troops. We had just finished a world war. The American public certainly wouldn't have supported it, and this was just really the best that we could do at the time, according to the government. By May of 1949, though, it is clear that the nationalists are on a rapid decline. Chiang and the nationalists leave China, and they set up a government on the island of Taiwan, which at one point was Formosa. And for a while, until, I'm going to get it wrong, it's sometime in the 90s, or it could be the 2000s. That's something to Google. Taiwan was kind of operating independently for a while, and it now is completely under control of current communist China. Mao Zedong and the Red Army take control of China. They name it the People's Republic of China, and the United States refuses to recognize them, which is quite interesting given the relationship that we currently have with China. Today, China still has a communist government. The government still controls a lot of the people's everyday aspect, but they are flirting with almost a capitalistic economy. Um, and that will be interesting to see how it plays out years down the road. That is, of course, what happened to the Soviet Union and brought about their decline. It is currently what is being dabbled in Cuba. America's absolutely stunned. We cannot believe containment failed. We felt surely we would be able to stop communism from spreading, and here we didn't do it. Republicans and Democrats actually blame Truman, and they say, Truman, you should have done more. You should have sent soldiers. You should have done this. We didn't do enough. It's all your fault. Isn't it important that we contain communism everywhere? We don't want it spreading anywhere because, of course, if communism comes into China, economically, we're worried about how that's going to affect our trading partner. How in the long run financially is this going to impact us? And the State Department basically comes back and says, listen, what happened in China wasn't really because we didn't give them enough. We didn't send them enough money. We didn't send them enough military supplies. It was personal problems or internal issues within China itself. And the fact that people just hated Shang. And what can you do when the country itself is set on a course to explode? We can't go in and make the people like the ruler. We couldn't have done that. We couldn't have made, I guess we could have marketed Chang more to the people. They were just fed up. And it's sort of the idea of once that happens, no matter what a foreign power does, and in this case, the United States, you're not going to change the course that had been set. Conservatives said that's completely lame. We can always make them understand with our military might. And the reason that we were not successful in ending communism in China or preventing communism in China is that within the United States itself and within the United States government, that the Communist Party, particularly the Soviet Union, had already put in spies, and that those spies were working to not only bring down the United States, but to make us appear weak so that communism could spread across the world. All right, so the Korean War, here's the backstory. Japan annexed Korea in 1919, and they ruled it until 1945. You get 3 guesses as to why that rule ended in 1945, and hopefully you only need one to know that they, of course, lost World War II. So when World War II ends, the Japanese troops north of the 38th parallel surrendered to the Soviets. Because remember, at the time, the Soviets and the Americans were both on the Allied teams, two different forms of government. We don't really like each other, but we're on the same team. So it didn't matter who you surrendered to, you still surrendered to the Allies. Well, it's interesting because the troops below the 38th parallel happened to surrender to the Americans. Well, now what happens is you would kind of get a split Korea. Then what's the northern part of Korea, which is above the 38th parallel, is getting guidance and aid from the Soviet Union, who's working with them to rebuild. Well, the southern part is getting guidance and aid from the Americans. So you're essentially setting up two different types of government or two different types of aid within the country itself because the people lending the aid are so different. So by 1949, the United States is like, Southern Korea, you got this going on. You're fine. You don't need our help. We're going to withdraw our troops. We're lowering the size of our army. We don't need to do all this. We are still scarred from World War II. Well, Stalin's like, this is awesome. It shows that America really isn't committed to containment. They're pulling their troops out. They should have known what I was going to do. So they must be completely okay with me going ahead and making North Korea my own little personal project. Turns out he was wrong. Um, South Korea, which calls themselves the Republic of Korea, is their president. I'm going to mispronounce his name because I do every time. Is Syngman Rhee, and their capital is Seoul, which had always been which was the traditional capital of the country of Korea. North Korea calls themselves the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I always find it interesting that a lot of times places that are either communist or dictatorships are always the democratic peoples of something when they're neither democratic nor for the people. Their leader is Kim Il sung, who is the great grandfather of the current leader of North Korea. And their capital is Pyongyang. So here's just a map if you don't know what Korea looks like. You can see the northern part in the green and the southern part in what I'm going to call a yellow. So June 25th, 1950, war starts when North Korea attacks South Korea. South Korea goes to the UN because the UN by this point had been set up. That was the proper chain of command. You go to the international peacekeeping group and you say, please help us. We are being attacked through no fault of our own. The UN votes to, of course, internationally send aid. And the reason that that goes over so well is it just happens that at the time the Soviet Union is boycotting the Security Council. And their votes aren't there, and so everybody else pretty much under the influence of the United States and Great Britain agree to do what we say. Truman also agrees to send a separate commission of just American troops. So the international peacekeeping body through the UN Army or the UN military, which is made up of volunteer regiments from all the different members of the UN. And then the United States says, okay, well, we are separately going to send our own coalition, mostly because he still remembers what had happened when we lost China, and we just can't see communism continuing to spread because that would mean that our foreign policy was a failure, and we aren't willing to let that happen. The troops are placed under the leadership of Douglas MacArthur, which we have already stated looks like Bruce Willis. He was in Japan, he was in the area, he had been setting up the democracy in Japan, which was going very, very well. He had been the military leader in the Philippines, he was a World War II hero, he was more than suited for the job. MacArthur launches a surprise attack on the north in September of 1950 and pushes troops back into the north. China at this point is like, oh, this is a fight really over communism versus non-communism. We're definitely going to join in. But if you also look at the map, North Korea shares a border with China, so obviously they are interested in it. We had not wanted China to get involved, but of course they were going to. So China joins in the side of the war on the north in 1950. It pushes the troops back to the south. And really, this becomes almost sort of the power struggle between China, the Soviet Union using North Korea as their pawn, and the United States using South Korea as our pawn, and almost a philosophical war over which is greater, communism or non-communism. The war reaches its stalemate, and essentially for the bulk of the war itself, which is really short, it's basically within this region, we're going to push this. The north is going to push down a little bit. The south is going to push up a little bit, and you sort of get to where you are there. By June 23rd, 1951, a ceasefire is suggested because it's clear that just nothing's going to happen. And in general, I think even the Soviet Union is, because it didn't go very quickly, the North invasion of the South, they didn't win. They saw that we pushed back. I think they're also in a way war weary as well. So here's what's interesting. MacArthur's like, ceasefire, schmears fire. He calls for an extension of the war into China because we might as well go ahead and fix the, I guess, the Chinese problem while we were in the area and had our military there. And he's like, listen, you know what we need to do? We need to use some nuclear weapons because that seemed to work really well with Japan. They certainly were more interested in listening to what we had to say afterwards. And he believes, and the quote is there, where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest. He really believes in something that's going to be touted around the Vietnam War and what will become domino theory, that is, if one country in Southeast Asia falls to communism, they all will. And he sort of feels like it all starts with Korea. This is going to be the point that if we lose Korea, then it's going to happen everywhere. And you'll see this launched a whole bunch more in a few years when we get to the Vietnam War itself. He really feared that not doing something now would start a World War III, but then the idea was that other people that disagreed with him using nuclear weapons also felt like that would start World War III. So both sides claim World War III is going to happen. And the quote from the Joint Chiefs of Staff is, wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy. If we were going to use a nuclear weapon against someone, it was going to be someone that we thought was of greater power, and that's the Soviet Union, because we thought the Soviet Union was the puppeteer in a way controlling China as well, since the Soviet Union had been the first really sort of international global power to be successful, if you will, with communism. So instead, we relaunched an attack, and in 1951, we're able to take back Seoul and push North Korea back to the 38th parallel again. MacArthur begins to insist on an attack of China, and then he tries to go over Truman's head. He's like, well, none of you were listening. I'm going to go over your head. Turns out, but you can't do that. I mean, you can, but then you end up with this. He begins speaking to Republican leaders, trying to cause division within Congress itself, within the White House, getting the Republican Congress to push against the Democratic president. He goes and talks about the press and basically just says Truman's a doofus. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's not a military commander. He's not really fit to be commander-in-chief. And basically he's told the commander-in-chief, which is President Truman, has told you to stand down and follow orders, as well as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In the end, April 1st, 1951, it was not an April Fool's joke, Truman fires MacArthur. And people are shocked. This was a national war hero. This was someone that conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, didn't matter who you were, everyone loved this man. He does return to the U.S. because he loses his job, so he can't be a soldier. And he gives his address to Congress and gets a huge ticker tape parade through New York City. And his famous quote, other than I shall return when he leaves the Philippines, is, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. So even though he's fired, he still is very revered in the American public. So finally, the Soviet Union's like, let's really, really and truly be done again. So we're back. Truce talks begin in July. An agreement is made to what is basically called a demilitarized zone, which is still at the 38th parallel. We spend another year exchanging POWs, and July 1953 is the official end of the Korean War. So what are the results? Well, we lost 54,000 American lives. We get the TV show MASH later on, which takes place during the Korean War. It costs us $64 billion, and it's basically seen as completely unsuccessful. We did prevent communism from spreading, I guess, in a way, because it didn't spread to South Korea. But we didn't really accomplish any other goals either, and the war pretty much is kind of like the War of 1812 in a way. Both sides are like, we're just done fighting, we're tired, we'll pick this up later on. Interestingly enough, though, it does cause Americans to reject the Democrat Party in 1952, and they will elect the Republican candidate and war hero from World War II, Dwight Eisenhower. It does lead to this huge, massive, overwhelming fear of communism within Americans. This fear that they are here, they are out to get us. The Soviet Union is going to bomb us any day. We need to be ready at all times. We can't even mention about how vigilant we need to be. And it just ups really what is known as the second Red Scare, and this fear that we need to protect our nation. And the way that we're going to protect our nation is by weeding out the communists that are secretly hiding within the United States. That ends the segment on the Korean War.